Welcome. In this episode, we're going to outline the basic blueprint of the American Revolution from the opening shots at Lexington and Concord until the peace treaty that ended the war 8 years later. By 1775, King George III has declared the American colonies, and Massachusetts in particular, to be in a state of open rebellion. He assumes that one of the most powerful militaries in the world will be able to crush it pretty easily. Over the course of the war, the British try three separate strategies. Plan A: contain what they think is a local rebellion in Boston and prevent it from spreading to the other colonies. Plan B: capture New York and isolate New England from the rest of the colonies, after which the other less militant colonies will fall back in line. Plan C: take advantage of the stronger loyalist support in the southern colonies to create a Pied Piper effect, with loyalist militias joining the British regulars on a march north, rolling up the colonies from south to north. Well, Plan A was a total flop. King George and his advisors had misread the situation, thinking it was just a small uprising centered in Massachusetts, and that things would be fine if they could just contain it there. So the king declares Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion in 1775, and the British army is ordered to seize weapons and ammo from the local rebels. Paul Revere warns the local militia, the Minutemen, that the Redcoats are on the way. So when the British Army shows up in Lexington, Massachusetts, the Americans are waiting, and we have the shot heard round the world. The British retreat back to Boston, where they hunker down, with the British Navy in Boston Harbor to provide support. 2 months after Lexington and Concord, the newly formed Continental Army puts up a good fight against the British at Bunker Hill. The British ultimately win the battle, but suffer many casualties and now understand that they have a real fight on their hands. The Americans had managed to capture Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York soon after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, so over the winter of 1775-76, they bring the cannons from that old fort down to Boston and line them up on high ground overlooking the city, making sure the British can see them. Seeing the cannons pointed straight at them and not being able to attack the heights where the cannons are because of the winter conditions, the British pack up and sail for Canada in March 1776, never returning to Boston. So Plan A, contain the rebellion in Boston and snuff it out quickly, has failed. So the British go to Plan B, take New York and sever New England from the rest of the colonies, who then will presumably settle down. In July 1776, 3 months after the British evacuate Boston, the largest British fleet in history takes New York, and in a series of battles, the British Army chases George Washington all the way through New Jersey and over the river into Pennsylvania. Washington didn't give up, though, and on Christmas night, 1776, he rows back across the river and wins two battles at Trenton and Princeton, New Jersey. This picks up the spirits of the American army as they settle in for the winter. As an aside, in those days, an army really couldn't do very much during the winter because the roads were so awful and they were usually buried in snow. In addition, you had to spend most of your time looking for firewood so you wouldn't freeze to death. So both the Americans and the British normally just went into winter quarters and waited for spring. With New York in hand, the British turned to the second phase of Plan B in 1777, cutting off the troublemakers in New England by seizing the Hudson River Valley. One column of British troops will come in from the west, one will come south from Canada, and one will go north from New York City. The three columns will meet in Albany, and with the Royal Navy controlling the sea lanes, New England will be completely sealed off and can be starved into submission. Well, the British column coming from the west doesn't make it. The one coming south from Canada is defeated by the Americans at the Battle of Saratoga, and the one that is supposed to head north from New York decides to go to Philadelphia instead. So Plan B is a bust, and the British don't cut off New England. But the British army that went the other way at least captures the American capital in Philadelphia. After losing again to the British outside of Philadelphia, George Washington settles his army in for the winter at Valley Forge. He spends the winter retooling the Continental Army so they can come out swinging in the spring. The real problem for the British now, though, is that the Americans' victory at Saratoga convinces France to join the war as America's ally. That really turns up the heat on the British because this has turned from what they thought was a local rebellion in Massachusetts into a global war against one of Europe's most powerful militaries. Now they're concerned that the French will try to take the British colonies in the West Indies, Gibraltar, and India, which were way more valuable to Britain than the 13 American colonies were. France even considered invading England itself. So Britain sends a substantial number of the army units and warships that it had been using against the American colonies to protect the West Indies and other more important places instead. That creates a real problem for the remaining British forces, which are already stretched pretty thin. So the British commanding general decides to evacuate Philadelphia and move his troops back to New York to make sure it's protected against the French. George Washington follows the British army across New Jersey on the way back to New York, fighting a major battle at Monmouth on the way. From that point on, the war in the North largely becomes a stalemate. So Britain failed to contain the rebellion to Massachusetts. Then they failed to use their stronghold in New York to seal off New England from the rest of the colonies, and actually made things even worse by having France jump into the war too. It's time for Plan C. Great Britain knows there are many loyalists in the southern colonies and believes that the southern colonies overall are less rabid about this whole affair than those fanatics in Massachusetts. Since they've had to remove so many troops and warships to protect the West Indies, they decide that if the British Army swings south and starts working its way north, the Loyalists will flock to the side of the British regulars, swell their numbers, and the combined force of redcoats and Loyalist militia can roll into the north with overwhelming numbers. Sort of a Pied Piper thing. Even if things ultimately don't work out in the northern colonies, at least Britain will have brought the valuable southern colonies back into the royal fold, and those troublemakers in New England can just go away. The Royal Navy gives the British Army a lift down south, where they capture Savannah and Charleston, all but eliminating the Continental Army's regular forces in the south. The British general in charge decides things are under control, so he goes back to New York, leaving Lord Charles Cornwallis in charge to wrap things up. Cornwallis wins several big battles against the Continental Army in the Carolinas, but the Loyalists in the area are not flocking to his side in the numbers he had expected. Patriot militias from the Carolinas and Tennessee, including guerrilla fighters with nicknames like the Swamp Fox and the Gamecock, continued fighting and winning at places like Kings Mountain and Cowpens in South Carolina. Cornwallis chases the American army around the Carolinas, steadily losing troops he was not able to replace and exhausting those who remain. The Americans aren't winning many battles against Cornwallis, but by gradually wearing the British down, they're doing just fine. So Cornwallis takes his remaining troops to coastal Virginia, where he hopes the Royal Navy can bring him reinforcements and supplies from New York, allowing him to regroup and try again. The problem is that the French Navy defeats the British fleet that is coming to reinforce Cornwallis. So Cornwallis finds himself on a small peninsula in Yorktown, Virginia, with an exhausted army waiting for reinforcements and supplies that will never arrive. George Washington, still outside New York, realizes the mess that Cornwallis has gotten himself into. So, along with General Rochambeau in the French army, he races south. Water to his back, massive American and French siege cannon staring him in the face, and no help in sight. Cornwallis surrenders his army to George Washington in October 1781. Plan C has failed. The war is not officially over yet. The British still hold New York and Charleston, but the British Parliament has had enough and a few months later votes against continuing the war. The Treaty of Paris ends the war in September 1783, marking the end of British rule in the former American colonies. Oh, but the British will be back in a few years, so stay tuned.